you're here. And we've got a great speaker this evening, Daniel Kawczynski, who is the Member of Parliament for Shrewsbury and Ascham. He didn't get in first time. He actually stood in Ealing Southall, which was slightly less a promising seat than Shrewsbury. But that was in 2001. But he's been the Member of Parliament for Shrewsbury and Ascham for 15 years now. And I've known him really since he appeared on the political scene. And in fact, I think he was before me as chairman of the candidates committee when he put his name forward. You can't miss Daniel. He stands head and shoulders above most folks, and he's a distinguished member of the House. Delighted to have you here this evening, Daniel. And as we were nattering earlier on, it would be very interesting to hear your own insight of how you have been relating your experience of British life to Polish people and what their reaction to Britain's Brexit is going to be. But your topic this evening is the UK, China, and the British Overseas Territories. So I'd be really interested to hear what you've got to say about a global Britain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of addressing you this evening. I'd like to say that, can you hear me all right?
Yes, fine.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yes. Sorry, could we just have Baroness Nicholson's recording, because she couldn't be...
I do apologize, Melissa. I missed that out.
Okay,
yes.
I'll just add...
Evening. Very, very best wishes to the July meeting of our Conservative Foreign and Commonwealth Council. My apologies for not being with you at the beginning of the meeting, but sadly, we're still sitting in the Lords and I can't be in 3 places at once, so my apologies. Our theme this evening is the United Kingdom, China, and British Overseas Territories, the latter of which I am extremely fond and with which I'm very familiar indeed. As we head into 2021 and we recover steadily from COVID, our relationship with our overseas friends becomes ever more important. We don't any longer speak within the caucus of the European Union, and that gives us both greater freedom, but also a need to speak out more strongly for ourselves and our colleagues, and of course, as members of the Commonwealth, which is the most exciting and largest bloc in the globe. Global Britain is back, and for us, foreign affairs and Commonwealth affairs are incredibly top priority. I work as a DIT, Department of International Trade, envoy in a number of countries, and I can tell you that Britain is top of the pops. We have all the trust and confidence from the others that we need, and we just have to get out there and do the job. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. I hope to look in later.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Emma. Yes, I do apologise for cutting you out inadvertently, and I hope we do see you later on. In the meantime, after Daniel's finished speaking, don't hesitate to raise your hand or send in a question so we can make the most use of the question time that follows Daniel's address. And I'm sorry, Daniel, getting you off to a false start. I'm sure you're ready to go now.
I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I speak to you as the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, having been born in communist Poland and coming to this country in 1978 because my parents fled the tyranny of communism. So it's always very interesting to talk to young people today in British schools, not just about those early years of my experience under communism, but going back in the 1980s to see my grandfather and relatives and seeing the sort of society that communism created in Poland, a politically illiterate system, an economically illiterate system, and which clearly did not withstand the test of time. And so I bring this different perspective of being the first ever Polish-British Member of Parliament, which is that I don't tend to want to hide our great British history and opportunities under a bushel. I think many British people tend to underestimate the British brand and the strength of British reputation around the world. Certainly when I was a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and when we traveled overseas, the one thing that struck me inescapably, whether it was visiting Commonwealth countries or the Middle East or further beyond, is the extraordinary high regard that many countries hold Britain in and the unique position that they afford us in helping to maintain the general world order that has been created after the Second World War. And of course, we are one of only 5 countries in the world that has that peculiar responsibility of being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. With that membership, only 5 countries have that, comes extraordinary responsibility and the need for us to ensure that we use our position in the world and our overseas territories to try to bring about stability and peace within certain regions of the world, but also to hold, in particular, I would argue at the moment, China, and I will come on to that. But last year, I was invited with 2 other members of Parliament by the Foreign Office to visit the British Indian Ocean Territory. Many people don't actually know where Diego Garcia is, but it is a paradise. If you can imagine a paradise, the white sandy beaches, the palm trees in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It is an absolute paradise. And yet, on this territory sits one of the most strategically important military installations that I have ever seen. It's almost as if God has created perfect artificial harbors for a whole flotilla of British and American ships. These are large atolls with a small gap in the middle of them where the ships can come in and rest. And what we saw there is a huge array of American vessels which we toured. 7, 8, 9 military ships, and inside them was hospital equipment, military equipment, tanks, all sorts of things which were just stationed there, ready to be used at a moment's notice in the eventuality of a flare-up within the Indian Ocean region or further in the Middle East. So all of these vessels had personnel on them and the equipment which can be flown very, very quickly to countries like Iraq, Syria and other countries where we have recently seen terrible internal conflict and tensions. I was very, very impressed that we were afforded the opportunity to visit these islands. Obviously, as tourists, members of the public are not allowed to visit them because of the huge sensitivities and the fact that they are military outposts. The concern that we found out whilst we were there is, of course, that now Mauritius is demanding to take these islands back from the United Kingdom. And in fact, Mauritius has referred the United Kingdom to various international panels within the United Nations and other bodies, and is demanding to, is creating a coalition of countries which are demanding that Britain returns these islands to Mauritius and therefore leaves this territory. If Britain gave up sovereignty, of course, the American and British military base on these islands would be put at risk. And let me say to you why I oppose that move so strongly, and how disappointed I am by the lack of support from the European Union. When there was a vote on this issue, only one country, would you believe, in the European Union voted with us to support us and British sovereignty over the British Indian Ocean territory, and that was Hungary. Rather surprising, isn't it, when a country like France has many overseas territories, and most European countries, being members of NATO, also benefit enormously from the hugely important military strategic position and equipment on these islands. The reason Mauritius is wrong is in the head of their independence, the United Kingdom cut off, separated these islands away from Mauritius. And the fact that they were going to be separate and maintain this British territory was embedded in the Treaty of Independence that was signed with Mauritius in 1965, and Mauritius voluntarily agreed to that change in the treaty, giving her her independence. So what she is seeking to do now, 50 years on, 50 years plus on, is she sees the huge importance of this territory, wants to have the money associated with leasing out the military base, and is determined to take these islands back from the United Kingdom, having agreed to their separation 50 years ago. We must retain these islands because of their strategic importance, but also because the people of these islands, the Chagos people, actually many of them live in the Seychelles, many of them, would you believe, live in Crawley. When they came to live in the United Kingdom, about 2,000 of them, many of them flew to Gatwick, and they settled in a constituency very close to Gatwick. And one of my colleagues, who's the MP for Crawley, is an expert on these people. And Andrew Rosendale and I, and he and others, believe that if these islands, that their future must be determined in conjunction with the wishes of those people, those 2,000 people who left the islands in 1965 when the British military base was set up. At the very least, they should be consulted, rather than Britain handing these islands back to Mauritius, as many in the UN are now demanding. If there's one thing that British people will always stand by, it is the right of self-determination and for people to be consulted. And thus far, the 2,500 people who originally were settling on these islands have not had an opportunity to be properly consulted as to whom they wish to have sovereignty over their islands. Now, the reason they are so important is because we have seen recently the extraordinary nefarious conduct of the Chinese within the South China Sea, which is very close by, and the Indian Ocean, and that whole region. I started to ask questions in the House of Commons 5 years ago to the then Foreign Secretary, Mr. Hammond, as to what the British government's attitude was about the plundering by China of hundreds of atolls in the South China Seas. The Spratly Islands are one chain, but there are hundreds of other atolls that exist in the South China Sea. These belong to Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and other countries. And the Chinese have just basically seized them. They have poured concrete onto them, and they are turning them into giant aircraft carriers with massive military installations, radar equipment, and positions for advanced military bases. Basically, the Chinese are turning the South China Sea almost into a Chinese lake, and nobody is doing anything about it. The answer that came back to me 5 years ago from Mr. Hammond was, we don't get involved in the South China Sea. We have no specific comment on that. We have no views on that. That is an internal matter for the countries concerned. I think that was a terrible mistake at the time to make those sort of decisions, because it has given the Chinese the green light to continue in the illegal seizure of all of these islands, the militarization of these islands, and not respecting the rule of law with regards to our other allies, the Philippines, Malaysia, and others, who themselves have tried to instigate legal proceedings against the Chinese over the seizures of these islands. Let's not forget that something like a third of global trade flows through the South China Sea at the moment. Some estimates put it as high as 40%. And the Chinese are starting to restrict the movement of foreign vessels through the South China Sea. There are only 3 countries at the moment at vast expense. Our own country is one of them, the United Kingdom, in conjunction with Australia and America. We are instigating freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea with large military vessels in order to constantly remind the Chinese that these are international waterways. They have no right to restrict commercial or military vessels through these international waters. Freedom of navigation is one thing, very, very important. And I'm speaking to you as the Conservative Foreign and Commonwealth Council, because you need to know just how dangerous and potentially unsustainable the whole situation is becoming in the South China Sea, the appalling conduct of the Chinese there, and the consequences for the global economy if we allowed them to take control of this vast waterway and to seal their control over these islands. Let's not also forget that the Chinese now have a permanent military and naval base in Djibouti. The Chinese have also recently, you may have read in the Daily Telegraph, fired on Indian troops on the border with India, and something like 60 Indian soldiers have been killed over the last few weeks in the first border clash between China and India. Very, very dangerous conduct by the Chinese. I'm only glad that finally this government is starting to wake up to the dangers of China, because I think under Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne, we were a little guilty of putting our own commercial interests with China ahead of pursuing our responsibility as a permanent member of the UN Security Council in holding the Chinese to account over their conduct in the South China Sea, towards India, and towards smaller countries in the Indian Ocean. I had the Japanese ambassador in my office before the lockdown, who was explaining to me their concerns about the almost weekly violation of their airspace by Chinese aircraft that were deliberately flying over Japanese islands. This is a country that has built up its military and economic strength beyond all recognition during the course of our lifetimes. And let's not forget the word that I used at the start of my speech. They are communist. And as somebody who has lived under a communist regime, the only Conservative member of Parliament out of 365 who has lived under communism, I know what communism is. I know what it stands for. And I know the appalling consequences of allowing Chinese dictators and despots to get away not only with the internal suppression of their own people, but with aggressive and hostile behavior towards other neighboring countries. We brought down the Soviet Union and the communist regimes of Central and Eastern Europe, not through détente and not through pandering to them, but we brought them down simply because we outspent them militarily, we put pressure on them economically, and we made them realize that their nefarious and unreasonable conduct of interference in other countries' internal affairs was not acceptable, and that we would pursue a line which exposed them and held them to account. We have at the moment in the House of Commons a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament, Alistair Carmichael, who was in the coalition government. He is sending a round-robin letter to all members of Parliament demanding that we hand back Diego Garcia to Mauritius. I find that very disconcerting. And there are many Labour members of Parliament who look upon Diego Garcia as a relic of a British Empire, something to be embarrassed about, something to brush under the carpet, something to forget, something to sweep away, something to give back and leave British commercial and military interests away behind closed doors rather than exerting them to the fore. That cannot be allowed to stand, and that is why I have asked to speak to you this evening, because of my passion and interest in holding on to this territory, which is legally British, and ensuring that it is utilized in an effective way for a resurgence of a policy east of Suez. And finally, I will say this. When I spoke to Lord Howell of Guildford, the former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons, and for many years the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the House of Lords, he said to me this: my kit was on the ship going to Suez when I was told that it was all over, it's finished, and we should forget, and I wasn't going to be sent out there. He told me something which will stay with me forever. He said that was the moment that the civil servants in this country started to say, we're too small, the empire's gone. Suez was such a jolt for us. In Britain doesn't have a habit of falling at the fence, not finishing the race, or failing. And Suez was such a jolt for the civil service in this country that we lost our confidence. And there was such a change of mindset amongst our civil servants who decided that we were too small and we had to join the European Economic Community. And subsequently, we have seen for 48 years a diminution of British global interests and being hamstrung within the EU straitjacket. I believe that Brexit will lead to a resurgence of Britain's global position in the world, a reassertion of our global military power, and the need to invest in our naval forces in order to guarantee that strength east of Suez, and that we are now coming back to an era where we can be proud of the extraordinary and unique position that the United Kingdom has and will have in maintaining the world order in a very, very dangerous and increasingly unstable international world.